Hey guys, tonight we're starting with the story of a queen whose life has been wrapped in mystery, tragedy, rumor, and more than a little royal drama. So, as always, find a comfortable place to settle in. Maybe grab a blanket, dim the lights, and let the noise of the day slowly drift away. Tonight, we're traveling back more than 500 years to medieval Spain, where one of history's most fascinating women became famous for a story that refuses to die. Queen, a widow, a prisoner, and according to legend, a woman so consumed by grief that she wandered across the countryside with her dead husband's coffin. Whether that story is entirely true is another matter. Because as we'll discover, history often prefers a dramatic tale over a complicated reality. And poor Juana of Castile ended up trapped inside one of the most dramatic tales of them all. Juana was born in 1479 into one of the most powerful families in Europe. Her parents were none other than King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile. Together they would become famous as the Catholic monarchs, the rulers who helped unite Spain and sponsor the voyage of Christopher Columbus. Not a bad resume. Most children grow up with parents asking whether they've finished their homework. Juana grew up with parents reorganizing kingdoms. The expectations were, understandably, a little different. As a young princess, Juana received an education that was exceptional for the time. She learned languages, religion, music, philosophy, and courtly manners. Contemporary accounts often described her as intelligent, thoughtful, and well-educated. Nothing in her childhood suggested she would one day become known to history as Juana the Mad. In fact, many people considered her one of the brightest members of the royal family. But royal children rarely got to decide their own futures. Their lives were pieces on a political chessboard. And when Juana reached marriageable age, negotiations began. Across Europe, dynasties were constantly looking for alliances. Wars could be expensive. Marriages were often cheaper. Sometimes, at least until the family arguments started. The chosen groom was Philip of Habsburg. History remembers him as Philip the Handsome, which sounds less like the name of a future king and more like someone who accidentally became popular on social media. Philip was the son of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I and belonged to the powerful Habsburg dynasty. The marriage would connect Spain with one of Europe's most influential ruling houses. Politically, it made perfect sense. Personally, that was another question. In 1496, Juana traveled to the Low Countries to meet Philip, and according to many accounts, the attraction between them was immediate, at least initially. Stories from the period describe intense passion, perhaps even infatuation. For a royal marriage arranged primarily for political reasons, this was unusual. Many noble couples spent decades politely tolerating one another. Juana and Philip appeared genuinely attracted to each other. For a while. The problem was that Philip turned out to be exactly the sort of man whose nickname should have raised concerns. Being handsome and being faithful have never been identical qualities. Philip was charming, popular, confident, and notoriously unfaithful. As the years passed, Juana became increasingly distressed by her husband's affairs. Court gossip spread constantly. Mistresses appeared and disappeared. Rumors multiplied. Some chroniclers claimed Juana experienced intense jealousy. Others described emotional outbursts. Still others suggested that political enemies exaggerated these stories for their own purposes. The truth is difficult to untangle. But one thing seems clear. The marriage became increasingly painful. Juana loved Philip deeply. Philip did not always return that devotion in the same way. And that imbalance created enormous suffering. By the early 1500s, the political situation had changed dramatically. Several deaths within the royal family unexpectedly transformed Juana into the heir to Castile. This was never supposed to happen. She had older siblings. There were other candidates. But one by one, tragedy removed them from the line of succession. Suddenly, Juana stood at the center of Spain's future, and that created a new problem. Everyone wanted power over the future queen. Her father wanted influence. Her husband wanted influence. Nobles wanted influence. Pretty much everyone except Juana seemed eager to decide what Juana should do. It was around this period that accusations regarding her mental health became more common. Reports described emotional instability, extreme grief, periods of depression, intense jealousy. But historians continue debating how accurate these accounts really are. Many of the people describing Juana's supposed madness had political motives. If she could be declared incapable of ruling, someone else could govern in her place. Convenient, isn't it? Throughout history, powerful women have often been labeled irrational whenever they became politically inconvenient. That doesn't mean Juana never struggled emotionally. She almost certainly did. But determining where genuine illness ends and political propaganda begins is extraordinarily difficult. In 1504, Queen Isabella died. Juana became Queen of Castile. Officially, the crown was hers. In reality, however, a fierce power struggle erupted almost immediately. Philip wanted authority. Ferdinand wanted authority. Especially when politics and personal tragedy become tangled together. What remains undeniable is that Juana endured extraordinary hardship. She lost siblings. She lost her mother. She lost her husband. She lost her freedom. And ultimately, she lost control over her own story. Others told it for her. Others defined her. Others decided what future generations would believe. Perhaps that is the saddest part. Not the coffin. Not the rumors. Not even the imprisonment. But the fact that a woman who legally ruled one of Europe's most important kingdoms became remembered primarily through the words of people who benefited from portraying her as incapable. And so tonight, as we leave the cold halls of Tordesillas behind, we're left with a haunting question. Was Juana the Mad truly mad? Or was she simply a grieving queen trapped inside a political game she could never win? 5 centuries later, historians are still debating the answer. And somehow that uncertainty makes her story even more fascinating. Because sometimes the most mysterious figures in history are not the ones we know least about. They're the ones we think we already understand. And with Juana of Castile, the deeper we look, the more complicated the picture becomes. Queen, prisoner, a widow, a legend, and perhaps one of history's most misunderstood women. For now, though, let the torches fade into darkness. Let the palace walls grow quiet, and let the long, strange story of Juana of Castile drift gently into the night. Now, if you were hoping that Juana's story would somehow improve after being locked away in Tordesillas, I'm afraid medieval history has once again decided to be medieval history. The years after Philip's death were not merely sad. They were strangely quiet. And sometimes quiet suffering lasts much longer than dramatic suffering. A battlefield ends eventually. A siege ends eventually. Even a storm eventually runs out of rain. But loneliness can continue for decades. And for Juana it did. The palace at Tordesillas stood near the Duero River in central Castile. From the outside, it looked respectable enough. Stone walls, courtyards, royal chambers. The sort of place modern tourists might photograph while imagining kings and queens enjoying elegant dinners. Reality, as usual, was less glamorous. For Juana, Tordesillas became a cage disguised as a residence. Official documents still called her queen. Visitors still addressed her with royal titles. Ceremonies still acknowledged her position. Yet she possessed almost no real authority. Imagine being told every day that you're the ruler of a kingdom while being unable to decide where you can walk. History has produced few ironies quite that cruel. At first, Ferdinand justified the arrangement as necessary. His daughter, he claimed, was not capable of governing. Therefore, someone else would need to govern on her behalf. Conveniently, that someone was Ferdinand himself. Now, to be fair, the situation was genuinely complicated. There were reports suggesting Juana struggled emotionally. Witnesses described periods of deep depression. Others claimed she neglected daily routines. Some reported unusual behavior. Yet nearly every source comes with a warning label. Most observers had political loyalties. Many benefited from Ferdinand's rule. Others benefited from Philip's faction. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Few appeared completely neutral. Modern historians often compare the evidence to looking through a window covered in mud. You can still see shapes. You can still identify outlines. But clarity remains frustratingly out of reach. One thing does appear certain. Juana was not completely detached from reality. Official records show occasions when she discussed politics intelligently. Visitors sometimes found her well-informed. She could recognize political developments and understand complex situations. This doesn't necessarily prove she was perfectly healthy, but it does complicate the image of a permanently irrational woman. Unfortunately, complicated realities rarely become famous. Dramatic legends do. And so while Juana sat inside Tordesillas, stories about her madness continued spreading across Europe. Meanwhile, life inside the palace settled into an uncomfortable routine. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. The same walls. The same rooms. The same guards. The same restrictions. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures. We can survive extraordinary hardships. But adaptation comes with a cost. Over time, isolation changes people. Even today, psychologists understand that prolonged confinement can affect mood, behavior, memory, motivation, and social interaction. Now imagine enduring that isolation not for months, not for years, but for decades, entire decades. Sometimes visitors reported finding Juana withdrawn and silent. At other times, she appeared engaged and conversational. The contradictions appear repeatedly throughout historical accounts. It is almost as though different people were describing different women. Or perhaps they were simply encountering the same woman on different days. After all, grief itself is unpredictable. Some mornings a person feels almost normal. Other mornings even getting out of bed feels impossible. Juana had experienced enough loss to overwhelm almost anyone. And she carried those losses without freedom, privacy, or independence. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, Europe was changing rapidly. The Renaissance flourished. Artists experimented with new ideas. Explorers crossed oceans. Religious tensions intensified. Powerful kingdoms expanded. The world was becoming more connected and more complicated. Yet Juana watched most of it from confinement. Perhaps the most painful aspect of her imprisonment involved her children. Historical records suggest her relationships with them were often strained by separation and political circumstances. Her children became important figures across Europe. Some ruled kingdoms. Others married into powerful dynasties. Yet Juana spent much of her life isolated from the family she had helped create. One daughter became Queen Catherine of Portugal. Another became Queen Eleanor of France. Still another became Queen Isabella of Denmark. Her son Charles became emperor. The family tree looked less like a family tree and more like a map of Europe. Everyone was becoming powerful. Everyone was influencing history. Everyone except their mother. There is something deeply tragic about that contrast. While her children governed nations, Juana remained trapped inside one building. And then there was Charles, the son who would become one of the most influential rulers of the 16th century. When Ferdinand died in 1516, Charles inherited enormous responsibilities. His territories stretched across Europe. Soon he would also become Holy Roman Emperor. His political position was staggering. The amount of power concentrated in one individual was almost difficult to comprehend. Officially, however, Juana remained queen. Legally speaking, she still possessed authority. In theory, Charles ruled jointly with his mother. In practice, she remained confined. The arrangement suited nearly everyone involved. Nobody wanted political uncertainty. Nobody wanted competing centers of power. And so Juana's imprisonment continued. Some historians have wondered whether Charles genuinely believed his mother was incapable of ruling. Others suspect political convenience played a larger role. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Human motives are rarely pure, especially in royal families. History often presents rulers as strategic masterminds. The reality is usually messy. People make decisions based on fear, ambition, affection, insecurity, duty, and self-interest all at once. Charles may have loved his mother. He may also have found her continued confinement politically useful. Those possibilities are not mutually exclusive. Human beings have always been complicated. Royal human beings simply had bigger consequences. As the years passed, visitors occasionally recorded glimpses of Juana's daily life. Some descriptions portray long hours spent in prayer. Others mention periods of stubborn resistance. There are accounts of disagreements with attendants, stories of emotional withdrawal, moments of unusual behavior. Yet once again, certainty remains elusive. How much reflected mental illness? How much reflected grief? How much reflected frustration? How much reflected decades of captivity? 500 years later, historians continue debating those questions. And perhaps they always will. Because unlike modern medical evaluations, historical evidence arrives fragmented. A letter here, a report there, a diplomatic observation, a court rumor, a second-hand account. Imagine trying to diagnose someone's mental health using scattered comments written by political rivals centuries ago. The challenge is enormous. Still, one conclusion feels unavoidable. Whether Juana suffered from mental illness or not, confinement almost certainly worsened her condition. Isolation rarely heals emotional wounds. More often, it deepens them. And Tordesillas offered isolation in abundance. The seasons passed endlessly outside her windows. Spring flowers bloomed. Summer heat arrived. Autumn leaves fell. Winter returned. Again and again and again. Year after year. Eventually, the world began forgetting the young woman Juana had once been. The educated princess. The intelligent daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. The politically important heir. Instead, the legend grew larger. The legend of the Mad Queen. Legends are efficient. Reality is complicated. And history often prefers efficiency. A grieving widow carrying her husband's coffin is easy to remember. A politically marginalized queen trapped by dynastic struggles is harder to summarize. Guess which version became famous? By the 1530s and 1540s, Juana had already spent longer in confinement than many people spent alive. Think about that. A person born when she entered Tordesillas could have reached middle age while she remained there. Children became grandparents. Governments changed. Wars started and ended. Yet Juana's circumstances barely changed at all. There is a haunting quality to that kind of stagnation. Most lives move forward. People relocate. Careers change. Families grow. Experiences accumulate. Juana's world became increasingly narrow. A handful of rooms. A limited circle of attendants. A routine repeated thousands of times. And yet she endured. Perhaps endurance itself deserves recognition. History often celebrates conquerors. It praises generals. It glorifies rulers. But surviving decades of loneliness requires its own kind of strength. Not dramatic strength. Not heroic strength. Quiet strength. The sort that rarely appears in paintings. The sort that history frequently overlooks. Eventually, even Charles V began approaching the end of his remarkable reign. The emperor who ruled vast territories grew older. His health declined. His responsibilities became burdensome. The world he governed had changed enormously. And still his mother remained alive. Still confined. Still officially queen. Still occupying that strange position between authority and powerlessness. Finally, in 1555, after nearly 50 years in Tordesillas, Juana died. She was 75 years old. By 16th century standards, that was an impressive age. Yet one cannot help wondering what those decades might have been like had circumstances unfolded differently. What if Philip had lived? What if political rivals had trusted her? What if she had been allowed to rule openly? What if grief had been treated with compassion rather than confinement? History never answers such questions. It simply leaves them behind. And perhaps that is why Juana continues fascinating people centuries later. Her story feels unfinished, not because we lack an ending. We know exactly how it ended. Rather, it feels unfinished because we can never be entirely certain who Juana truly was beneath the legends. The woman remains hidden beneath layers of rumor, propaganda, sympathy, and speculation. Some see a victim. Some see a ruler suffering mental illness. Some see a political prisoner. Some see all three at once. And maybe that's the closest we can come to understanding her. Not as a caricature, not as a legend, but as a human being living through circumstances almost impossible to imagine. A woman born into immense privilege, a woman surrounded by extraordinary power, and a woman who spent half her life unable to exercise either. The torches have long since gone out. The palace still stands. The centuries have passed. Yet Juana's story remains. A reminder that history's saddest prisons are not always built from stone. Sometimes they are built from grief. Sometimes from politics. And sometimes from the stories other people choose to tell about us. The making of Juana the Mad. Now here's where Juana's story becomes even stranger. Because up to this point, we've mostly talked about what happened to her. The marriage, the grief, the confinement, the endless years behind palace walls. But tonight we're going to talk about something equally powerful. Something that often survives longer than kingdoms, longer than armies, longer than kings. A story, more specifically, a story that people wanted to believe. Because once a historical figure becomes famous, something curious happens. The real person slowly begins disappearing. And in their place emerges a legend. Sometimes that legend is flattering. Sometimes it is cruel. And sometimes it becomes so successful that future generations forget there was ever a real human being underneath it. Juana of Castile became one of history's greatest examples. By the time many Europeans heard her name, they weren't hearing about a queen. They were hearing about a cautionary tale. The Mad Queen, the woman who supposedly lost her mind because of love. The woman who supposedly traveled with a corpse. The woman who supposedly could not govern herself, much less a kingdom. It's dramatic. It's memorable. And unfortunately, it's probably far too simple. History loves simple explanations. Real life almost never provides them. Let's imagine for a moment that you're a powerful nobleman in 16th century Castile. You want influence. You want stability. Most importantly, you want the government to function in a way that benefits you. Then suddenly the legal ruler of the kingdom is a woman whose husband has died, whose emotional state is being questioned, and whose father is trying to reclaim power. What narrative will be most useful? A complicated one, or a simple one? The answer is obvious. You'd tell people the queen is incapable. Case closed. Problem solved. Power transferred. Thank you for your attention. Politics has often worked exactly that way. The simplest story usually wins, especially when powerful people repeat it often enough. And that's exactly what appears to have happened around Juana. Now, this doesn't mean every accusation was invented. That would be going too far. Several contemporary observers genuinely believed she suffered from mental instability. Some described emotional outbursts. Others reported long periods of silence. Still others claimed she behaved unpredictably. Those reports exist. Historians cannot simply ignore them. The difficulty comes from determining what those observations actually mean. Consider grief. Severe grief can dramatically alter behavior. A person may become withdrawn. Sleep patterns change. Appetite changes. Concentration suffers. Social interactions become difficult. Motivation disappears. Now imagine experiencing that grief while surrounded by political enemies. Imagine every emotional moment being observed, every tear being noted, every mistake being recorded, every weakness being reported to ambitious rivals. That environment would challenge anyone, even today. And Juana had to navigate it 500 years ago. The more historians examine surviving documents, the more complicated the picture becomes. Some reports portray her as deeply troubled. Others portray her as surprisingly rational. In certain conversations, she demonstrated a clear understanding of political events. She recognized important individuals. She understood legal matters. She discussed current affairs intelligently. These are not necessarily the actions of someone completely detached from reality. Instead, they suggest a person whose condition may have fluctuated, or perhaps a person whose reputation had become larger than the truth. The problem is that once a reputation takes hold, it becomes difficult to challenge. People begin interpreting everything through that lens. If Juana remained silent, silence became evidence of madness. If she became emotional, emotion became evidence of madness. If she resisted authority, resistance became evidence of madness. Notice something interesting here. No matter what she did, it reinforced the narrative. That's a very difficult trap to escape. History contains many examples. Once society decides someone is irrational, almost every action can be interpreted as proof. Calmness becomes suspicious. Anger becomes suspicious. Defiance becomes suspicious. Even compliance becomes suspicious. It's rather like being trapped inside an argument where the conclusion has already been written. And unfortunately for Juana, many influential people had reasons to keep that conclusion intact. Her father benefited. Her husband had benefited. Later, her son benefited. Different political factions often disagreed about everything except one thing. Someone else should be exercising power. Not Juana. That consensus alone should make historians cautious. Whenever multiple ambitious politicians suddenly agree on something, it's usually worth asking why. The answer often involves power. And power was certainly involved here. One of the most fascinating aspects of Juana's story is how it reflects broader attitudes toward women in positions of authority. Now, before anyone accuses medieval Europe of inventing sexism, humanity unfortunately had centuries of practice already. Female rulers frequently faced challenges that male rulers did not. If a king became angry, he might be described as strong. If a queen became angry, she might be described as unstable. If a king fought aggressively, he demonstrated leadership. If a queen fought aggressively, critics questioned her temperament. The double standards could be remarkable. Juana lived in a world where many people still felt uncomfortable with female political authority. Her mother Isabella had overcome those obstacles through extraordinary skill and determination. But Isabella was exceptional. Most female rulers faced relentless scrutiny. Every decision attracted criticism. Every weakness attracted attention. Every failure attracted exaggeration. Juana inherited not only a kingdom, she inherited those expectations as well. Then came another powerful force: storytelling. Human beings adore dramatic stories. We always have. The tale of a queen driven insane by love is irresistible. It contains romance, death, madness, power, grief, a coffin, practically every ingredient needed for a best-selling historical drama. The reality, meanwhile, involved legal disputes, succession crises, dynastic politics, administrative authority, diplomatic negotiations, and competing claims to legitimacy. One of those options sounds like a gripping legend. The other sounds like paperwork. Guess which version survived? The Coffin story became particularly famous. For centuries, writers repeated increasingly to dramatic versions. Some claimed Juana opened Philip's coffin repeatedly. Others claimed she spoke to his remains. Still others insisted she wandered endlessly through the countryside with the body. Modern historians generally believe portions of these stories were exaggerated. Certain events did happen. The coffin was transported. Funeral arrangements became complicated. Political circumstances created delays. But later storytellers often added details that made the narrative more dramatic. This process happens constantly in history. A real event occurs. People tell the story. Then someone adds a detail. Another person improves the detail. A third person makes it even more dramatic. Eventually, the legend becomes more famous than the original event. By the 19th century, artists absolutely loved Juana's story. Painters created emotional scenes showing the grieving queen beside Philip's coffin. Writers embraced the romance and tragedy. Audiences adored it. The image became iconic. One particularly famous painting by Francisco Pradilla y Ortiz helped cement this vision in popular imagination. The scene is unforgettable. A lonely queen, a coffin, a bleak landscape, grief stretching endlessly into the distance. It's beautiful. It's heartbreaking. And like many famous historical images, it simplifies reality considerably. The painting depicts an emotional truth, not necessarily a literal one. The emotional truth is that Juana suffered enormously. That much is difficult to dispute. The literal details remain less certain. Meanwhile, modern scholarship has increasingly revisited her reputation. Historians now ask questions that previous generations often ignored. Who wrote the reports? Who benefited from them? What political goals existed? Which witnesses were trustworthy? How consistent are the accounts? These questions matter. Because historical sources are not magical windows into the past. They are human documents, and humans are biased. Always. Sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. Even the most honest observer sees events through personal assumptions. The result is that Juana's story has gradually become more nuanced. Few serious historians today accept the old legend without question. Likewise, few completely dismiss the possibility that she experienced genuine mental health struggles. The emerging picture is more complicated, and therefore more believable. Juana may have suffered from depression. She may have experienced episodes of mental illness. She certainly endured devastating grief. She also appears to have been used as a political tool by powerful relatives. All of those things can be true simultaneously. Human beings are rarely simple. Historical figures are no exception. In fact, complexity is often the strongest sign that we're approaching reality. Legends are simple. People are complicated. That's one reason Juana remains so fascinating after more than 5 centuries. The closer historians look, the harder it becomes to fit her neatly into a category. Victim? Yes. Queen? Certainly. Political prisoner? Arguably. Mentally ill? Possibly. Misunderstood? Almost certainly. And perhaps that's why her story continues capturing imaginations. Not because we fully understand her, but because we don't. Somewhere behind the rumors and paintings and political propaganda stood a real woman. A woman who laughed. A woman who learned languages. A woman who fell in love. A woman who mourned. A woman who spent decades watching the world continue without her. That woman remains partially hidden. The centuries have obscured her, yet every generation tries once more to uncover who she really was. And each generation discovers something surprising. Not about madness, not about coffins, not even about royalty, but about the extraordinary power of stories. Because stories shape memory. Stories shape reputations. Stories shape history itself. And few people demonstrate that better than Juana of Castile. A queen whose life was tragic enough on its own. A queen who never needed exaggeration. Yet somehow became one of history's most famous legends anyway. As the night grows quieter, imagine the halls of Tordesillas once more. Imagine the aging queen sitting beside a window, the years slipping by, the kingdom beyond her reach, and somewhere far in the future, generations of strangers arguing about who she really was. Perhaps she would find that amusing, perhaps frustrating, or perhaps she would simply recognize something timeless. That history rarely belongs entirely to those who live it. More often, it belongs to those who tell it afterward. And in Juana's case, they have been telling it for more than 500 years. Inside Tordesillas, 50 years behind palace walls. By now, we've followed Juana from royal princess to queen, from grieving widow to reluctant legend. But tonight, we're going somewhere quieter. Much quieter. We're stepping away from the grand politics of Europe. Away from emperors, ambassadors, succession disputes, and royal marriages. Instead, we're going to spend some time inside Tordesillas itself. Because one of the strangest questions in Juana's entire story is surprisingly simple. What exactly did she do all day? It's a question historians don't always ask. After all, dramatic events tend to attract more attention. Battles make headlines. Assassinations make headlines. Coronations make headlines. But ordinary Tuesdays rarely do. And yet Juana spent far more time living ordinary Tuesdays than experiencing extraordinary moments. For nearly 50 years, Tordesillas was her world. Not Spain. Not Europe. Not the vast kingdom she technically ruled. Just Tordesillas. A handful of buildings. A collection of rooms. The same corridors. The same walls. The same faces. Year after year. Imagine waking up every morning knowing exactly what the day will look like. And exactly what the next day will look like. And the day after that. And the day after that. For decades. The palace itself was not a dungeon. This is important to understand. Juana was not chained in a dark cell. She was not thrown into a pit. She was not living in conditions we typically associate with imprisonment. In fact, by the standards of 16th century Europe, her accommodations were comfortable. There were servants, food, private chambers, furniture, religious services, attendants. The surroundings were appropriate for a queen, at least on paper. But comfort and freedom are not the same thing. A golden cage remains a cage. History has repeatedly demonstrated that human beings value freedom far more than luxury. You can have soft pillows and still be miserable. Many rulers throughout history discovered this. Juana became one of them. Each morning likely followed a predictable routine. Attendants helped manage household affairs. Meals were prepared. Religious observances structured much of the day. Prayer occupied an important place in her life, particularly as she grew older. This was not unusual. Religion permeated nearly every aspect of 16th century society. For many people, faith provided comfort during difficult times. For someone experiencing profound grief and isolation, that comfort may have felt especially important. The rhythm of prayer created structure. And structure can be a powerful thing, particularly when the outside world feels uncertain. Historians know that Juana spent significant amounts of time engaged in religious practices. Visitors frequently commented on her devotion. Some saw it as evidence of sincere faith. Others interpreted it differently. As always, observers brought their own assumptions. The sources rarely agree on everything. But one thing becomes clear. Religion offered one of the few. Constants in a life filled with loss. Kings came and went. Political circumstances changed. Attendants changed. Entire generations passed. Yet the prayers remained familiar. The rituals remained familiar. The traditions remained familiar. In a world that had become unstable, familiarity possessed its own value. Still, even prayer could not eliminate loneliness. And loneliness appears repeatedly throughout accounts of Juana's later life. Not necessarily because she lacked company. Servants and attendants were constantly present. Rather, because companionship and connection are not identical things. A room can be full of people and still feel lonely. Many of us have experienced that. Now imagine feeling it for decades. The attendants themselves occupied a curious position. They were caregivers, supervisors, companions, observers, sometimes all at once. Their responsibility was to look after the queen. Their responsibility was also to report on the queen. Those goals occasionally conflicted. Imagine trying to build genuine friendships with people whose reports might eventually influence political decisions. Trust becomes difficult under those circumstances. Every conversation carries uncertainty. Every interaction contains a degree of caution. And so even social relationships could become complicated. Visitors occasionally arrived at Tordesillas. Members of the royal family, officials, clergy, diplomats. These visits offered brief interruptions to routine, moments when news from the wider world entered Juana's isolated environment. Imagine hearing about events that transformed nations while being unable to participate in them. Imagine learning that your children have become rulers, queens, and powerful political figures. Imagine hearing about wars, treaties, and royal marriages. Then imagine returning to the same rooms once the visitors left. The contrast must have been extraordinary. The world moved forward. Juana remained where she was. Perhaps one of the saddest aspects of her confinement involves time itself. Most people experience time through milestones, birthdays, weddings, journeys, achievements, changes. Our memories attach themselves to events. Those events help distinguish one year from another. But what happens when life becomes repetitive? When years begin resembling one another? When routines dominate experience? Historians studying long-term confinement often note that time can begin feeling strangely different. Days feel slow. Years feel fast. Monotony blurs memory. One season becomes difficult to distinguish from another. And Juana experienced enough monotony to fill half a century. Think about how much the world changed between 1505 and 1555. The transformation was immense. Yet inside Tordesillas, the pace was far slower. The palace became almost a separate universe. A place where time moved differently. A place where the same routines repeated again and again. Another significant part of Juana's daily life involved food. Now, before anyone gets too excited, 16th century royal dining was not quite the endless feast popular culture sometimes imagines. Meals could certainly be elaborate, but they also reflected health concerns, religious restrictions, seasonal availability, and personal preferences. Records suggest that attendants occasionally worried about Juana's eating habits. Some reports mention periods when she resisted food. Others describe disagreements regarding meals. Modern readers should be cautious here. Such accounts are difficult to interpret. Changes in appetite can result from numerous causes. Physical illness, depression, stress, grief, simple personal preference. Historical observers often lack the tools to distinguish between them. Nevertheless, food appears repeatedly in descriptions of her later years. Perhaps because meals represented one of the few events capable of breaking the day's routine. Breakfast, dinner, supper. Small markers dividing time. Small anchors in a repetitive world. Then there was the matter of physical movement. Human beings are designed to move. We walk, explore, travel, change environments. Juana's opportunities were limited. Certainly more limited than those available to a reigning monarch. Her world contained boundaries she could not cross. Even beautiful surroundings can become oppressive when departure is impossible. Imagine living beside a river for decades, watching its waters flow freely toward distant places, while you remain exactly where you are. There is something almost symbolic about that image. The river moving endlessly onward, the queen remaining behind. And then there were the nights. Long nights, quiet nights, the kind of nights where thoughts become louder. Historical records provide only occasional glimpses into Juana's sleeping habits. Yet anyone familiar with grief understands how difficult nights can be. During daylight hours, routines provide distraction. People remain busy. Tasks demand attention. But nighttime often removes those distractions. Memories return. Regrets return. Questions return. The mind wanders through old wounds. Juana carried enough old wounds to fill many sleepless nights. The death of Philip, the loss of her mother, the political betrayals, the separation from power, the years of confinement. Such experiences do not simply disappear. They remain, quietly, persistently, waiting in the darkness, Perhaps this helps explain why visitors sometimes encounter different versions of Juana. Some days, she appeared engaged, some days withdrawn, some days cooperative, some days resistant. Human beings are not static creatures. Our moods fluctuate. Our energy fluctuates. Our resilience fluctuates. Juana's emotional life likely reflected those realities. Yet observers often interpreted every fluctuation through the lens of madness. Once again, the legend influenced perception. Everything became evidence. Everything became part of the narrative. And so the years continued. One decade, then another, then another. Attendants aged, officials died, rulers changed, children became adults, grandchildren appeared. The queen remained. Imagine being remembered less as a person and more as a condition. Less as Juana and more as the Mad Queen. That reputation followed her throughout her confinement, even as the real woman continued living behind the label. Laughing occasionally, praying occasionally, arguing occasionally, remembering, forgetting, growing older. In many ways, that's the tragedy at the center of her story. Not merely that she lost power, not merely that she lost freedom, but that she gradually disappeared behind her own legend. Visitors arrived expecting to see madness, and therefore often found it. Few arrived hoping to see complexity. Yet complexity was almost certainly what existed. Because real people are always more complicated than the stories told about them. As the decades passed, Juana transformed from a political problem into something else entirely. A living relic. A reminder of an earlier generation. A queen whose legal status remained important even when her practical authority did not. She became part of the furniture of Spanish politics. Always present. Rarely consulted. Never entirely forgotten. And so life inside Tordesillas continued. Quietly. Slowly. Almost invisibly. No dramatic escapes. No triumphant returns to power. No miraculous reversals of fortune. Just day after day. Year after year. A human life unfolding behind palace walls. When modern people hear about kings and queens, they often imagine excitement, adventure, luxury, constant activity. Juana's later years offer a different lesson. Sometimes royal life could be painfully ordinary, painfully repetitive, painfully lonely. And perhaps that loneliness, more than any rumor or diagnosis, explains why her story still resonates centuries later. Because beneath the crowns and titles, beneath the politics and legends, lies a deeply human experience. The experience of watching life move on without you. The experience of wondering what might have been. The experience of carrying grief through years that seem to stretch forever. Tonight, as the halls of Tordesillas grow quiet once more, imagine the aging queen standing beside a narrow window. Beyond it, the Spanish countryside fades into evening. The river continues flowing westward. The seasons continue changing. The world continues turning. And inside the palace, another day slowly comes to an end, much like the thousands that came before it. And the thousands that would follow, the children of Juana, how confined queen became the mother of an empire. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the strangest ironies in all of European history. Because while Juana spent much of her life confined inside Tordesillas, her children were busy becoming some of the most powerful people on earth. It's one of those historical contrasts that almost feels unfair. There sat the mother, isolated behind palace walls. And out beyond those walls, her sons and daughters were marrying kings, ruling kingdoms, commanding armies, and shaping the future of Europe. In fact, if you were to draw a map of 16th century royal families, you'd quickly discover that Juana's children seemed to appear everywhere. Portugal, France, Denmark, Hungary, Austria, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire. It was almost as if Europe collectively decided that one family simply wasn't quite influential enough. So naturally they needed influence everywhere. Dynastic politics has always had a tendency to get a little excessive. To understand how this happened, we need to go back to Juana's marriage with Philip the Handsome. Despite all the difficulties in their relationship, the marriage produced 6 children. And those 6 children would eventually become the foundation of one of the most powerful dynasties in European history. At the time, nobody could have predicted just how influential they would become. After all, royal families constantly produced children. That was practically the entire business model. The goal was simple: produce heirs, secure alliances, avoid succession crises, try not to accidentally start a civil war. Unfortunately, European monarchies rarely managed that final objective. Still, Juana's children turned out to be unusually significant. Perhaps the most famous was her eldest son, the future Emperor Charles. Born in 1500, Charles entered a world already crowded with political expectations. His grandparents were Ferdinand and Isabella. His father belonged to the Habsburg dynasty. His family connections stretched across Europe. Even before learning to walk, he possessed enough inheritance claims to make diplomats nervous. As Charles grew older, those inheritances began accumulating at an astonishing rate. Kingdoms, territories, titles, responsibilities. The list seemed endless. First came the Burgundian lands inherited from his father. Then Spain from his grandparents. Then vast territories in Italy. Then Austrian possessions. Then the title of Holy Roman Emperor. At a certain point, Charles was collecting kingdoms the way some people collect postcards. Historians still marvel at the scale of his inheritance. His empire stretched across Europe and into the Americas. The famous saying eventually emerged that the sun never set on his domains. And technically, because of overseas territories, that statement wasn't entirely wrong. Meanwhile, where was his mother? Still in Tordesillas. Still confined. Still legally queen. The contrast remains astonishing. The most powerful ruler in Europe was governing in the name of a woman who lived under supervision. History occasionally develops a dark sense of humor. This may be one of its best examples. Now, Charles's relationship with Juana remains a subject of debate. Some historians believe he genuinely cared for her. Others emphasize the political benefits of keeping her isolated. The truth may involve both. Human relationships rarely fit neatly into categories, particularly within royal families. Royal families had all the emotional complications of ordinary families. They simply added armies, kingdoms, and succession disputes, which tended to make Thanksgiving dinner slightly more stressful. Charles visited his mother on several occasions. Records suggest he treated her respectfully. Yet respect did not translate into freedom. The confinement continued, year after year. One cannot help wondering what those meetings felt like. Imagine becoming one of the most powerful men in the world while your mother remained a prisoner of circumstance. Imagine discussing affairs of state with someone who technically outranked you. Imagine knowing that her signature still carried legal significance. The situation was extraordinary and deeply tragic. Juana's daughters experienced equally remarkable destinies. Take Eleanor, for example. She eventually became Queen of Portugal and later Queen of France. That alone would qualify as an impressive royal career. Most people would consider becoming queen once a considerable achievement. Eleanor somehow managed it twice. Then there was Isabella. She became Queen of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Imagine moving from the sunny landscapes of Spain to Scandinavia. The climate adjustment alone must have been memorable, particularly during winter. European dynastic marriages often required extraordinary adaptability. One day you're living in Castile. The next day you're learning entirely new customs hundreds of miles away. And everyone expects you to represent international diplomacy while doing it. No pressure. Another daughter, Maria, became Queen of Hungary and Bohemia. Yet another daughter, Catherine, became Queen of Portugal. Everywhere one looks, Juana's children occupied thrones. It's almost dizzying. At times the family resembles less a royal dynasty and more a continent-wide franchise operation. And throughout it all, Juana remained physically separated from many of them. This separation is one of the saddest aspects of her story, because behind every famous monarch stood an ordinary human relationship. A mother, a son, a daughter, letters, conversations, memories, affection, disagreements, the same emotional bonds that exist in families today. Yet politics frequently interfered. Distance frequently interfered. Confinement certainly interfered. Modern people often imagine royalty as glamorous. What we sometimes forget is how much separation accompanied that glamour. Children were raised by attendants. Marriages were arranged internationally. Families scattered across continents. Personal desires frequently surrendered to political necessity. Juana experienced all of those realities, and then experienced them while isolated from power. There is another fascinating aspect to her children. Several inherited traits that historians have spent centuries discussing. The Habsburg dynasty became famous for both its extraordinary political success and its increasingly complicated family tree. Royal families often preferred marrying within a limited circle of noble houses. The goal was preserving alliances and protecting dynastic interests. Unfortunately, biology does not always cooperate with political ambitions. Over generations, repeated intermarriage created challenges. Modern historians and geneticists frequently examine the consequences. Juana's descendants would eventually include some of the most recognizable figures in European history. Their achievements were enormous. Their problems were equally enormous. Empires expanded. Religious conflicts intensified. Wars erupted. Political rivalries multiplied. The family inherited not only power but also responsibility. Sometimes crushing responsibility. And this raises an intriguing question. Did Juana know what her children were accomplishing? To some extent, yes. News reached Tordesillas. Visitors arrived. Information circulated. She was not completely cut off from reality. She knew her son had become emperor. She knew her family occupied important positions. She knew the dynasty was thriving. Yet knowing something and participating in it are very different experiences. Imagine watching your children achieve extraordinary success while remaining unable to share fully in their lives. Pride and sadness can coexist. In fact, they often do. Historians occasionally glimpse hints of that complexity in surviving accounts. Moments where Juana discussed family matters. Moments where she displayed awareness of broader events. Moments that remind us she was still a mother, not merely a historical symbol. That's easy to forget. Historical figures often become reduced to labels. Emperor, queen, prisoner, legend. But underneath those labels existed ordinary emotions. Concern, hope, regret, affection, worry. The same emotions that connect human beings across centuries. One particularly interesting aspect of Juana's legacy is how thoroughly her descendants reshaped Europe. The Habsburg dynasty would dominate continental politics for generations. Through marriage, inheritance, and strategic alliances, they accumulated remarkable influence. At times it seemed as though every major political event involved a relative of Juana somewhere in the background. Negotiating, governing, fighting, marrying, inheriting, repeating the cycle all over again. Yet while the dynasty flourished, Juana's personal reputation moved in the opposite direction. Her children became symbols of power. She became a symbol of madness. Think about that contrast for a moment. History celebrated their achievements. History questioned her sanity. The imbalance is striking, particularly because without Juana, the dynasty itself would not have existed in its famous form. She occupied the critical link connecting Spanish and Habsburg power. Her inheritance made much of the family's future success possible. In a very real sense, she helped create the political landscape her descendants inherited. Yet her own role often receives less attention than theirs. That's another recurring pattern in history. The people who enable great events are not always the people remembered for them. Sometimes they're overshadowed by those who come afterward. Sometimes their stories become distorted. Sometimes they become footnotes in narratives they helped make possible. Juana deserves more than a footnote. Not because she conquered territories, not because she commanded armies, but because her life reveals something important about power itself. Power does not guarantee happiness. Power does not guarantee freedom. Power does not even guarantee control over one's own reputation. Here was a queen, a legitimate ruler, the mother of emperors and queens, the ancestor of dynasties, and yet she spent decades living under restrictions imposed by others. If that isn't one of history's great ironies, it's difficult to imagine what would qualify. As the years passed inside Tordesillas, generations continued growing around her. Children became rulers. Rulers became legends. Legends became history. And still Juana remained, aging quietly while her descendants shaped continents. Perhaps she sometimes reflected on the extraordinary paths their lives had taken. Perhaps she remembered them as children. Before the crowns, before the titles, before the politics. Parents often do. No matter how famous their children become, they still remember scraped knees and childhood laughter. History records emperors. Mothers remember children. And somewhere behind the walls of Tordesillas, those memories may have been among Juana's most valuable possessions. Because titles can be taken away. Power can be taken away. Freedom can be taken away. But memories are much harder to imprison. Tonight, as we leave the sprawling Habsburg family behind, remember this remarkable contradiction. One woman sat confined for nearly half a century, yet her descendants ruled much of Europe. One woman lost control over her own kingdom, yet her family gained control over countless others. One woman became known as the Mad Queen, yet she helped create one of the most powerful dynasties the world had ever seen. And perhaps that's why her story remains so compelling. Because the farther we follow her life, the less it resembles a simple legend, and the more it resembles a profoundly human tragedy unfolding on an imperial scale. The final years of Juana, the slow fade of a forgotten queen. Tonight, we're entering the last chapter of Juana's long and complicated life. The chapter that rarely receives as much attention as the Coffin stories, or the political conspiracies, or the endless debates about her mental health. Because history often prefers dramatic beginnings and dramatic endings. The quiet years in between tend to be overlooked. And Juana's final decades were, above all else, quiet, not peaceful, not necessarily happy, but quiet. By the 1540s, Juana had already spent most of her adult life in Tordesillas. Think about that for a moment. Entire generations knew her only as the queen who lived behind palace walls. For younger courtiers and officials, it was simply the way things had always been. Juana had become part of the political landscape, a permanent fixture, almost like a mountain in the distance, always present, rarely questioned. People had grown accustomed to her confinement, and perhaps that is one of the saddest things that can happen to any human being. When extraordinary suffering becomes ordinary in the eyes of others, at some point, people stop asking whether something should continue. They simply accept that it will. The years rolled onward, and with them came old age. Now, old age is not particularly selective. Kings experience it. Queens experience it. Peasants experience it. Generals, merchants, priests, scholars, all eventually discover that time is undefeated. History is full of conquerors who managed to defeat entire armies but couldn't defeat their own knees. Juana was no exception. As she entered her 60s and 70s, physical health became an increasing concern. Contemporary reports describe periods of illness, periods of weakness, periods where attendants worried about her condition. Some accounts mention difficulties with mobility. Others describe increasing frailty. None of this was unusual. 16th century medicine was not exactly operating at modern standards. Doctors did their best with the knowledge available. Unfortunately, their best often included treatments that modern physicians would consider deeply alarming. Bloodletting remained popular. Various herbal remedies were prescribed. Dietary restrictions appeared frequently. Medical theory was still heavily influenced by ancient ideas regarding bodily humors. In short, if you became seriously ill in the 16th century, your chances depended heavily on luck, and perhaps a little divine intervention. Throughout these years, Juana remained under supervision. The attendants changed. The administrators changed. The guards changed. But the system remained. She was never fully released, never officially restored to independent rule, never allowed to resume the life that had been taken from her decades earlier. One cannot help noticing the permanence of it all. Political emergencies are usually temporary. Wars end. Crises end. Yet Juana's confinement became a lifetime condition. At some point, the original justification almost stopped mattering. The arrangement simply continued because it had already continued for so long. History occasionally develops that kind of momentum. A decision made in one decade becomes a tradition in the next, then a habit, then an unquestioned reality, and eventually nobody remembers how unusual it once seemed. Yet even in old age, evidence suggests Juana retained moments of awareness and clarity. Visitors occasionally reported coherent conversations. She recognized important individuals. She understood aspects of current events. These reports continue frustrating historians because they resist simple conclusions. If only Juana had behaved in one consistent way, researchers might have an easier task. But human beings rarely cooperate with historians. Instead, they insist on being complicated. And Juana remained complicated until the end. The image of a permanently irrational woman simply doesn't fit all the evidence, nor does the image of a perfectly healthy ruler unjustly imprisoned. Reality appears to exist somewhere in between. And perhaps that uncertainty is exactly why her story remains fascinating. Around her, the world continued changing. The Protestant Reformation had transformed Europe. Religious conflicts intensified. Empires expanded. Exploration connected distant continents. The political landscape looked dramatically different from the one Juana had known as a young princess. Imagine witnessing such enormous change from the same location, watching history pass by like travelers on a road while you remain standing still. That experience must have felt surreal. By this stage, many of the people who had shaped Juana's early life were long gone. Her mother Isabella had died decades earlier. Her father Ferdinand had died decades earlier. Philip had been dead for nearly half a century. Friends, relatives, rivals, attendants, entire generations had disappeared. There is something haunting about reaching old age under those circumstances. The world slowly fills with ghosts. Every room contains memories. Every anniversary recalls someone who is no longer there. And Juana had accumulated more memories than most. One particularly interesting question concerns how she viewed her own life. Unfortunately, historians cannot answer it. We have reports written by visitors, reports written by officials, reports written by observers. But we have very little that reveals Juana's private thoughts directly. That absence creates a kind of silence at the center of her story. Everyone talked about Juana. Very few listened to Juana. And that pattern followed her throughout life. Men debated her fitness to rule. Politicians discussed her condition. Ambassadors reported on her behavior. Artists painted her. Writers described her. Yet the queen herself often remains frustratingly distant, almost hidden behind layers of interpretation. It's one reason modern historians approach her story with caution. The surviving evidence frequently tells us what others thought about Juana. Determining what Juana thought about herself is far more difficult, perhaps impossible. Still, we can make one observation with confidence. She endured. Year after year, decade after decade. That alone deserves recognition. Endurance is not glamorous. Nobody builds monuments to patience. Nobody commissions heroic paintings of surviving another difficult year. Yet endurance may be one of the most impressive human qualities. And Juana possessed it in abundance. Finally, in 1555, the long story approached its conclusion. Juana was 75 years old. By the standards of the era, she had lived an exceptionally long life. Many of her contemporaries had died decades earlier. The queen who had once stood at the center of Europe's political future was now an elderly woman nearing the end of her journey. Accounts from her final period suggest declining health. The details remain limited. Historical records from the 16th century rarely provide the medical precision modern readers might hope for. Still, it is clear that age and illness gradually took their toll. And then, after nearly 50 years in confinement, Juana died. Quietly, without dramatic fanfare, without a political revolution, without a miraculous restoration to power. History sometimes denies people the endings they deserve. Juana never reclaimed her kingdom, never cleared her reputation during her lifetime, never escaped the circumstances that had defined so much of her adulthood. Instead, she died where she had lived for decades, inside Tordesillas, the palace that had become both home and prison. Her death marked the end of an extraordinary chapter in European history. Officially, she remained Queen of Castile throughout those years. Technically, her reign had lasted longer than many rulers' entire lifetimes. Yet much of that reign had existed only on paper. The contrast remains remarkable. One of Europe's longest-serving queens exercised remarkably little actual power. After her death, the political situation became simpler. No more legal complications. No more questions regarding shared sovereignty. No more concerns about competing claims. For administrators, the matter was resolved. For historians, however, the questions were only beginning. Because death has a curious effect on reputation. It freezes it. The person disappears. The story remains. And once the story remains, people begin reshaping it, expanding it, simplifying it, romanticizing it. Over the centuries that followed, Juana increasingly transformed from a historical figure into a symbol. Artists emphasized tragedy. Writers emphasized romance. Popular storytellers emphasized madness. The real woman gradually disappeared beneath the legend. Ironically, her death may have accelerated the process. A living person can contradict stories. A dead person cannot. The generations that followed inherited an image rather than a biography. The grieving widow, the Mad Queen, the woman with the coffin. Those elements became famous. The quieter realities often did not. The decades of confinement, the political manipulation, the legal complexities, the ordinary routines of survival. Such details lack the dramatic appeal of legend. Yet they may reveal more about Juana than the famous stories ever could. Today, historians continue revisiting her life. New interpretations emerge. Old assumptions are challenged. Researchers compare sources, reevaluate evidence, ask difficult questions. And with each generation, the picture becomes slightly more nuanced, slightly more human. Increasingly, scholars recognize that Juana's story cannot be reduced to a single explanation. She was neither purely victim nor purely ruler, neither purely healthy nor purely ill, neither purely powerless nor purely influential. She was all of these things at different times, which is another way of saying she was human. Humans rarely fit inside neat categories. History keeps trying anyway. As we reach the end of Juana's life, perhaps the most important lesson isn't about royalty at all. It's about reputation. The stories people tell about us, the labels attached to us, the ways those labels can persist long after reality becomes more complicated. For centuries, people thought they knew Juana. Modern historians increasingly suspect they only knew the legend. And maybe that's fitting, because few figures demonstrate the power of storytelling quite so clearly. A queen lost her freedom. Then she lost control of her narrative. And somehow the second loss lasted even longer than the first. Tonight, the halls of Tordesillas finally fall silent. The footsteps fade. The attendants disappear. The old queen's long vigil comes to an end. Yet her story continues. Not because we have all the answers, but because we don't. 5 centuries later, Juana remains one of history's great mysteries. Not hidden in a forgotten tomb, not buried beneath lost documents, but hidden inside a simple question that still refuses to go away. Who was Juana of Castile, really? The legend offers one answer. History offers another. And somewhere between the two, the real woman still waits to be found. After death, how a forgotten queen became an immortal legend. Now that Juana's life has come to an end, you might think her story is over. Historically speaking, that would be the sensible assumption. Most biographies end when the subject dies. The person is buried. The chapter closes. Everyone goes home. But history has never been particularly interested in being sensible. In fact, some historical figures become more famous after death than they ever were during life. And Juana of Castile is one of the best examples. Because the strange truth is that the legend of Juana the Mad truly began flourishing after Juana herself was gone. The woman died in 1555. The myth was only getting started. And over the centuries that followed, artists, writers, dramatists, poets, and historians would transform her into something far larger than life. Not a queen, not a political prisoner, not a complicated human being, a symbol, a tragic symbol, The difference matters. Because symbols don't need nuance. Real people do. And nuance has never sold as many books as tragedy. Let's begin with something historians know very well. The farther away people move from an event, the easier it becomes to romanticize it. Reality tends to be messy. Memory tends to be tidy. Suppose you're writing about Juana 100 years after her death. You don't need to worry about political details anymore. The legal disputes are gone. The succession crisis is ancient history. Most of the participants have been dead for generations. What's left? Emotion. And emotion is far easier to sell. The image of a queen wandering beside her dead husband's coffin. The image of obsessive love. The image of grief so powerful it shattered reason itself. Those images captured people's imaginations. And once they did, there was no stopping them. Writers loved Juana. Poets loved Juana. Playwrights loved Juana. She offered everything a storyteller could want. Beauty, power, romance, betrayal, death, madness, imprisonment. It's practically unfair. Most historical figures only provide one or two dramatic themes. Juana somehow managed to provide all of them at once. As a result, every generation reinvented her, and every generation added something new. The process happened gradually. At first, chroniclers repeated existing stories. Then later writers expanded them. Eventually, entire works of literature appeared based on her life. The historical woman slowly disappeared beneath layers of interpretation. Imagine painting the same portrait over and over again. Each artist adds a new layer. Eventually, the original face becomes difficult to see. That's essentially what happened to Juana. One of the biggest changes occurred during the Romantic era. Now, if you've never encountered 19th century Romanticism, here's a brief summary. Romantic artists looked at history and said, "You know what this needs? More emotion." And then they added enormous amounts of emotion. The 19th century adored tragic figures, particularly tragic women. The era was fascinated by doomed love, melancholy, loneliness, and beautiful suffering. In other words, Juana was almost perfectly designed for romantic tastes. The romantic imagination took her story and embraced it completely. Suddenly, she wasn't merely a historical queen. She became the ultimate heartbroken woman. A queen destroyed by love. A widow consumed by grief. A soul wandering endlessly through darkness. It was powerful. It was dramatic. And it wasn't always particularly accurate. But accuracy and popularity have never been close friends. The most famous example arrived in 1877. That year, Spanish painter Francisco Pradillo y Ortiz created what would become one of the most iconic images associated with Juana. The painting is known as Juana la Loca. Even if you've never heard its title, you've probably seen reproductions somewhere. The scene is unforgettable. Bleak landscape, cold skies, members of a funeral procession, and at the center, a solitary queen standing beside her husband's coffin. The image radiates grief. Everything about it is designed to communicate sorrow. When viewers look at the painting, they don't see political intrigue. They don't see legal disputes. They don't see dynastic succession. They see heartbreak. And heartbreak is universal. You don't need a history degree to understand it. That's part of the painting's genius. It transformed a complicated historical figure into an emotional experience. People instantly understood what they were supposed to feel. Sympathy, sadness, pity, perhaps even fear. Because the painting suggests something unsettling. That love itself can become destructive. That grief can become a prison. That devotion can become obsession. Whether those ideas accurately describe Juana is another question entirely. But they made for extraordinary art. And extraordinary art often shapes historical memory more effectively than historical research. Most people never read archival documents. Millions look at paintings. As a result, Pradilla's vision became enormously influential. For countless viewers, that image became Juana. Not one interpretation. The interpretation. The queen frozen forever beside a coffin. Yet here's something interesting. The painting reveals just as much about 19th century Spain as it does about 16th century Spain. Because every generation projects its own concerns onto history. Victorians saw one version of Juana. Romantics saw another. Modern historians see something different again. History is never viewed directly. It's always filtered through contemporary perspectives. And those perspectives constantly change. The 20th century brought additional reinterpretations. Novelists explored her psychology. Filmmakers dramatized her life. Screenwriters emphasized romance. Sometimes they emphasized madness. Occasionally they emphasized political manipulation. Each adaptation highlighted different aspects of her story. Each created a slightly different Juana. By this point, there were almost as many Juanas as storytellers. The passionate Juana. The tragic Juana. The imprisoned Juana. The political Juana. The insane Juana. The misunderstood Juana. The victimized Juana. The romantic heroine. The broken queen. The fierce queen. The forgotten queen. All coexisting simultaneously. Which version was correct? Perhaps none completely. Perhaps all partially. The challenge for historians is separating evidence from interpretation. And that challenge becomes more difficult when dealing with someone as famous as Juana. Because fame creates momentum. Once people become attached to a story, they resist changing it. The Coffin story is a perfect example. Modern scholars have raised significant questions about some of its details. Yet the image remains powerful. People want it to be true. Not necessarily because they dislike history, but because it's memorable. The succession crisis is ancient history. Most of the participants have been dead for generations. What's left? Emotion. And emotion is far easier to sell. The image of a queen wandering beside her dead husband's coffin. The image of obsessive love. The image of grief so powerful it shattered reason itself. Those images captured people's imaginations. And once they did, there was no stopping them. Writers loved Juana. Poets loved Juana. Playwrights loved Juana. She offered everything a storyteller could want. Beauty, power, romance, betrayal, death, madness, imprisonment. It's practically unfair. Most historical figures only provide one or two dramatic themes. Juana somehow managed to provide all of them at once. As a result, every generation reinvented her, and every generation added something new. The process happened gradually. At first, chroniclers repeated existing stories. Then later writers expanded them. Eventually, entire works of literature appeared based on her life. The historical woman slowly disappeared beneath layers of interpretation. Imagine painting the same portrait over and over again. Each artist adds a new layer. Eventually, the original face becomes difficult to see. That's essentially what happened to Juana. One of the biggest changes occurred during the Romantic era. Now, if you've never encountered 19th century Romanticism, here's a brief summary. Romantic artists looked at history and said, "You know what this needs? More emotion," and then they added enormous amounts of emotion. The 19th century adored tragic figures, particularly tragic women. The era was fascinated by doomed love, melancholy, loneliness, and beautiful suffering. In other words, Juana was almost perfectly designed for romantic tastes. The romantic imagination took her story and embraced it completely. Suddenly, she wasn't merely a historical queen. She became the ultimate heartbroken woman. A queen destroyed by love, a widow consumed by grief, a soul wandering endlessly through darkness. It was powerful. It was dramatic. And it wasn't always particularly accurate. But accuracy and popularity have never been close friends. The most famous example arrived in 1877. That year, Spanish painter Francisco Pradillo y Ortiz created what would become one of the most iconic images associated with Juana. The painting is known as Juana la Loca. Even if you've never heard its title, you've probably seen reproductions somewhere. The scene is unforgettable. Bleak landscape, cold skies, members of a funeral procession, and at the center, a solitary queen standing beside her husband's coffin. The image radiates grief. Everything about it is designed to communicate sorrow. When viewers look at the painting, they don't see political intrigue. They don't see legal disputes. They don't see dynastic succession. They see heartbreak. And heartbreak is universal. You don't need a history degree to understand it. That's part of the painting's genius. It transformed a complicated historical figure into an emotional experience. People instantly understood what they were supposed to feel. Sympathy, sadness, pity, perhaps even fear. Because the painting suggests something unsettling. That love itself can become destructive. That grief can become a prison. That devotion can become obsession. Whether those ideas accurately describe Juana is another question entirely. But they made for extraordinary art. And extraordinary art often shapes historical memory more effectively than historical research. Most people never read archival documents. Millions look at paintings. As a result, Pradillo's vision became enormously influential. For countless viewers, that image became Juana. Not one interpretation. The interpretation. The queen frozen forever beside a coffin. Yet here's something interesting. The painting reveals just as much about 19th century Spain as it does about 16th century Spain. Because every generation projects its own concerns onto history. Victorians saw one version of Juana. Romantics saw another. Modern historians see something different again. History is never viewed directly. It's always filtered through contemporary perspectives. And those perspectives constantly change. The 20th century brought additional reinterpretations. Novelists explored her psychology. Filmmakers dramatized her life. Screenwriters emphasized romance. Sometimes they emphasized madness. Occasionally they emphasized political manipulation. Each adaptation highlighted different aspects of her story. Each created a slightly different Juana. By this point, there were almost as many Juanas as storytellers. The passionate Juana. The tragic Juana, the imprisoned Juana, the political Juana, the insane Juana, the misunderstood Juana, the victimized Juana, the romantic heroine, the broken queen, the fierce queen, the forgotten queen, all coexisting simultaneously. Which version was correct? Perhaps none completely. Perhaps all partially. The challenge for historians is separating evidence from interpretation. And that challenge becomes more difficult when dealing with someone as famous as Juana. Because fame creates momentum. Once people become attached to a story, they resist changing it. The Coffin story is a perfect example. Modern scholars have raised significant questions about some of its details. Yet the image remains powerful. People want it to be true. Not necessarily because they dislike history, but because it's memorable. Humans are storytelling creatures. We naturally gravitate toward narratives that make emotional sense. A queen driven mad by love makes emotional sense. A queen caught between dynastic politics, grief, gender expectations, mental health struggles, and succession disputes is more complicated. Reality often loses these competitions, at least initially. Fortunately, historians are stubborn people. Their entire profession involves asking inconvenient questions. Questions like, who wrote this source? Why did they write it? What were their motivations? Who benefited from this narrative? How reliable is this testimony? Those questions have transformed our understanding of Juana. Over the last several decades, researchers have increasingly challenged simplistic portrayals. They've examined documents more carefully. They've reconsidered political contexts. They've questioned assumptions that earlier generations accepted without hesitation. The result has been fascinating. Modern Juana scholarship often presents a woman who is neither purely mad nor purely sane, neither purely victim nor purely ruler. Instead, she appears profoundly human. And perhaps that's the most radical interpretation of all. Human beings prefer categories. Mad, sane, hero, villain, victim, tyrant. History constantly reminds us that real people rarely fit neatly into any of them. Juana certainly doesn't. In many ways, the modern reassessment of Juana reflects broader changes in historical thinking. Historians today are more interested in complexity than certainty, more interested in context than labels, more interested in understanding than judging. Rather than asking, was Juana mad? Many now ask, what experiences shaped her behavior? That's a very different question, and often a more useful one, because it acknowledges uncertainty. It accepts that historical figures were people rather than symbols, and symbols can never fully capture human lives. Still, the legend survives. It probably always will. Stories that powerful rarely disappear completely. The image of Juana beside the coffin remains one of Europe's great historical myths. The nickname Juana the Mad remains instantly recognizable. Artists continue finding inspiration in her life. Writers continue revisiting her story. Filmmakers continue reinventing her. 5 centuries later, she remains culturally alive. That's an extraordinary achievement. Most rulers are forgotten. Most queens vanish into footnotes. Juana became immortal, not through conquest, not through military victories, not through political achievements, but through storytelling. And yet there's a bittersweet quality to that immortality, because the story people remember isn't always the story she lived. Perhaps that is the final tragedy. Or perhaps it's simply the fate of anyone who becomes legendary. The real person fades. The myth remains. Tonight, as we close this chapter, imagine all the versions of Juana that have existed across 500 years. The historical queen, the grieving widow, the prisoner of Tordesillas, the romantic heroine, the tragic icon, the subject of paintings and novels, the woman behind the legend, all layered together, all impossible to separate completely. And somewhere beneath those layers stands the real Juana, still elusive, still mysterious, still resisting simple explanations. Perhaps that's why her story continues fascinating people after so many centuries. Not because we finally understand her, but because we don't. The more we learn, the more complicated she becomes. And in a strange way, that complexity may be the closest thing to truth history can offer. The Queen died in 1555. The legend never did. And even now, long after the torches have gone out and the palace halls have fallen silent, people are still telling her story, still arguing about her life, still wondering who she really was. For a woman who spent decades confined behind walls, that's a remarkable kind of freedom. Her body remained in Tordesillas. Her story traveled everywhere. The real Juana, what modern historians believe today. Tonight, after traveling through decades of grief, politics, imprisonment, legends, paintings, and myths, we're finally arriving at perhaps the most difficult question in Juana's entire story. Who was she really? Not the queen in the famous paintings. Not the woman wandering beside a coffin. Not the tragic heroine imagined by 19th century novelists. Not even the mad queen that generations learn about in school books. The actual Juana. The flesh and blood woman who lived between 1479 and 1555. As it turns out, finding her is surprisingly difficult. Because history left us with thousands of pages about Juana, yet very few pages written by Juana herself. And that's a problem. Imagine trying to understand someone's life by reading only what other people said about them. Their enemies, their rivals, their relatives, their political opponents, their servants, their observers, their gossiping neighbors. You might learn something useful, but you'd also inherit their biases. And biases, unfortunately, never went out of fashion. Historians today approach Juana's story with much greater caution than previous generations. Rather than accepting old narratives at face value, they examine who created those narratives in the first place. And once they do, some fascinating patterns emerge. For example, let's think about the three most influential men in Juana's adult life. Her father, Ferdinand, her husband, Philip, and her son, Charles. Notice something interesting. All three benefited politically from limiting Juana's authority. Now, that doesn't automatically mean they invented stories about her. History is rarely that simple. But it does mean historians have good reason to be skeptical. Whenever someone gains power from another person's supposed incapacity, questions naturally arise. It's one of those situations where even a modern lawyer might raise an eyebrow. And historians have raised quite a few eyebrows over the years. Let's start with Ferdinand. After Isabella's death in 1504, Juana became Queen of Castile. Legally speaking, the kingdom belonged to her, not Ferdinand, not Philip, her. Yet Ferdinand continued exercising enormous influence. If Juana were viewed as fully capable of governing, his position would become much weaker. That's simply political reality. Then there was Philip. Philip also had reasons to control government. His authority in Castile depended heavily upon his relationship with Juana. The stronger her independent position became, the more complicated his ambitions became. Again, this doesn't prove dishonesty, but it certainly creates incentives. And incentives matter. Historians pay close attention to incentives. Finally, there was Charles, perhaps the most powerful of them all. Charles ruled an empire that stretched across continents. His government benefited enormously from stability. A confined mother created fewer political complications than an active queen asserting independent authority. That fact alone doesn't explain everything, but it forms part of a larger picture. A picture in which multiple powerful individuals benefited from keeping Juana politically sidelined. And that's where modern interpretations begin. Not with certainty, but with questions. The biggest question concerns mental illness. Did Juana genuinely suffer from psychological disorders? Many modern historians believe the answer is probably yes, at least to some extent. The evidence suggests periods of emotional distress, periods of depression, episodes of unusual behavior, intense grief, possibly severe anxiety, perhaps other conditions as well. The challenge is that diagnosing someone 5 centuries after their death is incredibly difficult. Modern psychiatrists need interviews, medical histories, observations, context. Juana left none of those things behind in a form we would recognize today. Instead, historians are trying to reconstruct a psychological portrait using fragmented documents written by people with their own agendas. It's like assembling a puzzle when half the pieces are missing and several others belong to a different puzzle entirely. Still, certain possibilities appear repeatedly in modern scholarship. Some researchers suspect depression. Others suggest mood disorders. Some propose that prolonged grief played a significant role. Others emphasize the effects of isolation. All of these theories have supporters. None have been conclusively proven, and they probably never will be. History often leaves us with probabilities rather than certainties. Yet one idea has gained considerable support. Even if Juana experienced genuine mental health challenges, condition was likely exaggerated for political purposes. Those are not mutually exclusive possibilities. A person can struggle emotionally and still be manipulated. A person can suffer from depression and still be capable of governing. A person can experience psychological distress without being completely incapable of rational thought. Modern discussions tend to emphasize these nuances. Earlier generations often did not. For centuries, people treated mental health as an all-or-nothing concept. Either sane or insane, either capable or incapable. Reality is usually far more complicated, and Juana's life illustrates that complexity beautifully. One of the strongest pieces of evidence comes from moments when she displayed clear political understanding. Numerous reports describe coherent conversations, awareness of current events, recognition of important figures, understanding of legal and governmental matters. These moments don't necessarily prove perfect mental health, but they do challenge the stereotype of constant madness. The stereotype simply doesn't fit all the evidence. Another major factor involves confinement itself. Modern psychology has taught us a great deal about the effects of isolation. Humans are social creatures. We require interaction, purpose, autonomy, meaningful relationships. Take those things away for long enough, and emotional difficulties often follow. Now remember Juana's situation. Decades of confinement, limited freedom, constant supervision, political uncertainty, personal loss, family separation. Even a psychologically healthy person might struggle under those circumstances. Many historians believe this context deserves far more attention than it traditionally received. Instead of asking whether Juana was mad before her confinement, they asked how confinement may have influenced her later behavior. That's a significant shift in perspective, because it changes Juana from a passive subject into an active participant in her own story. Rather than merely asking what's wrong with her, historians ask what happened to her. Those are very different questions, and often much more humane ones. Another fascinating area of modern scholarship concerns gender. For centuries, female rulers faced scrutiny that male rulers rarely experienced. This isn't speculation. The historical record is overflowing with examples. A male ruler's anger might be interpreted as strength, A female ruler's anger might be interpreted as instability. A male ruler's stubbornness could become determination. A female ruler's stubbornness could become irrationality. The double standards were real, and Juana lived in a world where those standards were deeply embedded in political culture. That doesn't mean every criticism of her was unfair, but it does mean historians must evaluate those criticisms carefully. Context matters. Assumptions matter. Cultural expectations matter. When modern scholars revisit Juana's story, they do so with those considerations in mind. The result is a much richer understanding, one that acknowledges both personal struggles and political manipulation, one that avoids simplistic conclusions, one that accepts uncertainty. Ironically, uncertainty may be the most honest answer available. The further historians investigate, the less certain they become. And that's not failure. It's progress. Because genuine historical understanding often replaces simple answers with complicated ones. The old version of Juana's story was straightforward. A queen loved her husband too much. She lost her mind. She was imprisoned. Then, the modern version is far messier. A queen experienced grief, political conflict, family pressures, possible mental health challenges, gendered expectations, dynastic struggles, and decades of confinement. Suddenly, the story becomes much harder to summarize, but also much closer to reality. Reality tends to be inconvenient that way. It refuses to fit neatly into legends. Perhaps that's why Juana remains such a compelling figure today. She exists at the intersection of so many important questions. Questions about power. Questions about mental health. Questions about gender. Questions about family. Questions about historical memory itself. Few historical figures allow us to explore all those themes simultaneously. Juana does. And that's one reason historians continue returning to her story generation after generation. Not because they have solved the mystery, but because the mystery remains fascinating. In many ways, Juana serves as a reminder that historical figures were people first. Not symbols, not diagnoses, not cautionary tales. People. People who experienced joy and grief, love and betrayal, hope and disappointment. People whose lives were every bit as complicated as our own. The difference is that their complications unfolded in castles instead of office buildings. Their family disputes involved kingdoms, and their mistakes ended up in history books. As midnight settles over our story, imagine Juana one final time. Not as a legend, not as a painting, not as a nickname, just as a woman, a daughter of powerful parents, a wife, a mother, a queen, a prisoner, a survivor, a human being navigating circumstances few of us can truly imagine. For centuries, people called her the Mad Queen. Modern historians increasingly prefer a different approach. They ask not whether she was mad, but whether history itself misunderstood her. And perhaps that question tells us as much about ourselves as it does about Juana. Because every generation inherits stories. The challenge is deciding which stories deserve a second look. And few stories deserve that second look more than the life of Juana of Castile. The queen behind the legend. The woman behind the myth. The mystery behind one of history's most enduring names. And even now, more than 500 years later, she continues inviting us to look closer. ## Part 9, The Dark World of Royal Marriage. Why Juana's tragedy was more common than you think. By this point in our story, it's tempting to view Juana's life as uniquely tragic. And in many ways, it certainly was. After all, not every queen spent nearly 50 years confined in a palace. Not every ruler became the subject of centuries of debate. Not every woman was transformed into one of history's most famous legends. Yet when historians step back and examine the broader world Juana inhabited, something surprising emerges. Her suffering wasn't entirely unusual. The details were unusual. The scale was unusual. But the underlying problems, those were remarkably common. Because beneath the glittering crowns and magnificent palaces, royal marriage was often a deeply uncomfortable institution. Modern fairy tales have done a remarkable job convincing people that marrying a prince was the ultimate dream. History occasionally responds to that idea by laughing quietly in the corner. Real royal marriages were rarely fairy tales. More often they resembled diplomatic agreements disguised as weddings. Imagine being 16 years old, or 14, or sometimes even younger. Then being informed that your future spouse has already been selected. You've never met them. You may not speak their language. You may have to move hundreds of miles away. And the primary purpose of the marriage is strengthening political alliances. Your personal feelings are considered an interesting but largely irrelevant detail. Welcome to royal life. That was the world Juana entered. And she was far from alone. Throughout Europe, princes and princesses existed as political assets. Their marriages helped create alliances, prevent wars, secure borders, strengthen dynasties. In theory, everyone benefited. In practice, the individuals involved often had very little choice. Consider Juana's own parents. Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile became one of history's most successful royal partnerships. They genuinely worked well together. Their marriage transformed Spain, but even they represented an exception rather than the rule. Many royal couples were far less fortunate. Take the case of Catherine of Aragon, Juana's younger sister. Catherine married the future King of England. At first, things appeared promising. Then politics intervened, as politics tends to do. Eventually her husband, Henry VIII, became determined to end the marriage. The consequences transformed English history. Religious upheaval followed. Political upheaval followed. Personal heartbreak followed. Catherine spent her later years separated from her daughter and stripped of much of her former status. Not exactly the ending promised by fairy tales. Then there was Mary, Queen of Scots. Her marriages produced political crises, rebellion, imprisonment, and eventually execution. Again, not particularly fairy tale material. Royal biographies have a remarkable tendency to end with imprisonment, or exile, or assassination. Occasionally all three. And that's before we even discuss emotional realities. One of the strangest aspects of royal marriage was the complete mismatch between public expectations and private experiences. Publicly, royal weddings were grand spectacles. Crowds celebrated. Church bells rang. Nobles feasted. Poets wrote flattering verses. Everyone smiled, at least officially. Privately, however, the people getting married often barely knew each other. Imagine signing the most important contract of your life after a single conversation. That was effectively what many royal marriages involved. And unlike modern relationships, there was usually no practical exit. Divorce was difficult. Annulments were controversial. Separation created political complications. The marriage existed whether happiness existed or not. Juana's marriage to Philip illustrates this perfectly. At first, genuine attraction appears to have existed. That alone made their situation somewhat unusual. Many royal couples never developed any romantic connection at all. Yet attraction did not guarantee happiness. Philip's infidelity repeatedly damaged the relationship. Jealousy emerged. Conflict emerged. Distrust emerged. The emotional consequences appear to have been severe. Modern readers often focus on Juana's reactions. Less attention goes to Philip's behavior. Yet repeated infidelity can be devastating in any marriage. Royal marriage did not magically eliminate human emotions. People still experienced hurt, anger, humiliation, fear. The crowns merely made those emotions public, and public suffering carries its own challenges. Imagine experiencing marital problems while entire kingdoms watch. Imagine every disagreement becoming gossip, every argument becoming political news, every emotional reaction becoming a subject of international discussion. That's the reality many royals faced. Privacy barely existed. Even bedrooms occasionally became matters of state, which is a sentence guaranteed to make modern people uncomfortable. Yet it was true. Royal marriages belonged partly to the public because dynastic succession depended upon them. Producing heirs wasn't merely a personal decision. It was a political responsibility. The pressure could be immense, particularly for women. A queen's ability to produce children often determined how contemporaries judged her value. Fail to produce an heir and criticism followed. Produce only daughters and criticism often followed. Produce too few children and criticism followed. Produce too many children and health risks multiplied. It was a system filled with impossible expectations. Juana successfully produced 6 children. Even that achievement did not protect her from political vulnerability, because royal women occupied an inherently difficult position. They possessed immense status, yet often limited independence. They influenced politics, yet frequently through indirect means. They could shape history, yet were often excluded from formal authority. The contradiction appears again and again. Queens stood near power. Sometimes they possessed power, yet their positions remained precarious. One illness, one political dispute, one succession crisis. Everything could change. Juana learned this lesson brutally. As soon as questions emerged regarding her mental fitness, powerful men began exercising authority in her place. That pattern repeated throughout history. A king experiencing emotional distress might receive sympathy. A queen experiencing emotional distress might lose power. The distinction mattered, and it could determine entire lives. Perhaps the darkest aspect of royal marriage involved loneliness. This surprises many people. After all, royalty lived surrounded by servants, courtiers, guards, attendants, diplomats, advisors, and relatives. How could they be lonely? Quite easily, as it turns out, because companionship and trust are not the same thing. Many royal figures spent their lives wondering who genuinely cared about them. Who wanted access? Who wanted influence? Who wanted favors? Who wanted power? The higher someone's status rose, the more difficult those questions became. Juana's story repeatedly illustrates this problem. She was surrounded by people, yet often isolated, observed constantly, yet rarely understood. That's a uniquely painful form of loneliness, and she wasn't alone in experiencing it. Numerous monarchs described similar feelings. Power attracts attention, not necessarily connection. Another issue involved geography. Royal marriages often required enormous relocations. A princess might leave her homeland forever, travel hundreds or thousands of miles, learn new customs, learn new languages, adapt to unfamiliar courts, all while under intense scrutiny. Homesickness became common. Isolation became common. Cultural misunderstandings became common. Imagine moving to another country where every mistake becomes international gossip. That's a difficult adjustment by any standard. Juana herself relocated to the Low Countries after marrying Philip. The experience undoubtedly transformed her life. New surroundings, new court culture, new expectations. The transition was significant. And significant transitions often create emotional strain. Modern psychology recognizes this clearly. Yet historical observers sometimes interpreted that strain differently. What we might call stress, they sometimes called instability. What we might call depression, they sometimes called weakness. The language changed. The experiences remained remarkably similar. Perhaps that's one reason Juana's story still resonates. Because beneath the crowns and castles, her struggles feel recognizable. Not identical to modern experiences, but recognizable. Love complicated by betrayal. Grief complicated by politics. Family conflict. Isolation. Questions about identity. Questions about autonomy. These themes remain familiar across centuries. The clothing changes. The architecture changes. Human emotions do not. As historians examine royal marriages more closely, a pattern emerges. Many famous queens endured circumstances that would challenge anyone. Political pressure, public scrutiny, limited personal freedom, uncertain relationships, constant expectations. Juana's tragedy was extraordinary, yet it also reflected broader realities. The palace was not always a sanctuary. Sometimes it was simply a more luxurious prison. And that realization changes how we view figures like Juana. Rather than seeing her as an isolated anomaly, we begin seeing her as part of a larger story. A story about power, about gender, about family, about the hidden costs of monarchy itself. Because every crown came with a price. Sometimes that price involved war. Sometimes it involved responsibility. Sometimes it involved loneliness. And sometimes, as in Juana's case, it involved losing control over one's own life. Tonight, as the candles burn low in distant royal chambers, imagine the countless princes and princesses who entered arranged marriages believing duty demanded it. Some found happiness. Many did not. Some gained kingdoms. Others lost themselves. And among them all, few stories reveal the emotional cost of royal life more clearly than that of Juana of Castile. A queen whose tragedy was unique, yet whose suffering was, in many ways, painfully familiar. Because history's grandest palaces often conceal very ordinary heartbreak. And sometimes the loneliest person in the kingdom was the one sitting closest to the throne. The world that created Juana, life, fear, and survival in 16th century Spain. Before we leave Juana behind completely, there's one more journey worth taking. Because it's easy to view her story through a modern lens. We hear about confinement and immediately imagine injustice. We hear about grief and immediately think about therapy. We hear about political manipulation and immediately look for villains. But the world Juana lived in was very different from ours. To truly understand her life, we need to understand her world. And once we step into 16th century Spain, something becomes clear almost immediately. This was not a comfortable age. It was a magnificent age, powerful age, a wealthy age for some, but comfort, not so much. The Spain of Juana's lifetime was a place of enormous contradictions. On one hand, it was becoming one of the most powerful kingdoms on earth. Ships crossed oceans. Gold flowed from overseas territories. Armies marched across Europe. Spanish influence expanded dramatically. The kingdom stood at the center of world-changing events. On the other hand, Everyday life remained filled with uncertainty. Disease lurked everywhere. Famine appeared regularly. Child mortality was heartbreaking. Medical knowledge remained limited. Life expectancy was short. Even wealthy people lived with risks modern societies rarely consider. A simple infection could become fatal. A minor injury could become deadly. A fever could change everything. This was the reality surrounding Juana from birth. People often forget how fragile life felt before modern medicine. Today, many illnesses are inconveniences. In the 16th century, they were threats. The death of Philip the Handsome provides a useful example. One day, he was a healthy young ruler. Shortly afterward, he was dead, 28 years old, gone. Modern readers often search for dramatic explanations. Poison, conspiracy, assassination. Sometimes the truth is less dramatic. People simply died, frequently, unexpectedly, and everyone knew it could happen. Living with that awareness shaped entire societies. Religion became especially important partly because uncertainty was everywhere. People sought meaning, comfort, explanation, hope, and religion offered all four. 16th century Spain was profoundly Catholic. Faith influenced nearly every aspect of daily life: politics, education, marriage, law, art, family relationships. Even the calendar itself revolved around religious observances. To modern observers, this can be difficult to fully appreciate. Religion wasn't merely something people did. It was the framework through which many people understood reality itself. Juana grew up immersed in that framework. Her mother, Isabella, was famously devout. The royal court emphasized religious observance. Church attendance was expected. Prayer structured daily routines. Religious festivals shaped the year. When Juana spent long hours praying later in life, contemporaries would not necessarily have found this unusual. Many people did the same. The difference lay in interpretation. When an ordinary widow prayed extensively, it was devotion. When a controversial queen prayed extensively, some observers saw evidence of instability. The action remained identical. The interpretation changed. This happens more often in history than we might like to admit. Context frequently shapes judgment. Another defining feature of Juana's world was hierarchy. Everything had a place. Everyone had a place. Or at least that was the ideal. Kings ruled. Nobles served. Peasants worked. Priests guided spiritual life. The social order appeared fixed. Questioning that order could be dangerous. Modern societies placed enormous emphasis on individual freedom. 16th century societies emphasized duty. The difference is significant. People were expected to fulfill roles. Daughter, wife, mother, queen. Each carried obligations. Personal desires often rank below collective expectations. Juana's life illustrates this perfectly. Her marriage was arranged for political reasons. Her movements were determined by political circumstances. Even debates about her mental health were inseparable from political considerations. Individual autonomy simply occupied a different position in the cultural hierarchy. That doesn't mean people lacked personal feelings. Far from it. People loved, grieved, dreamed, argued, complained, exactly as they do today. But they often express those emotions within different social constraints. Understanding those constraints helps explain many aspects of Juana's story. Then there was the matter of reputation. In a world without social media, reputation might seem less important. Actually, the opposite was often true. Reputation could determine marriage prospects. political alliances, career opportunities, inheritance disputes, legal outcomes, trustworthiness, everything. News traveled more slowly than today, but gossip traveled surprisingly well. Royal courts functioned as information networks. People observed constantly, commented constantly, judged constantly. A rumor could spread across Europe, particularly when royalty became involved. Juana's reputation demonstrates this perfectly. Stories about her behavior circulated widely. Ambassadors reported them. Courtiers repeated them. Political rivals amplified them. The process looked remarkably familiar. The technology changed. Human nature did not. Another aspect of 16th century life that modern people often underestimate is the role of family. Family wasn't merely important. Family was everything. Identity emerged from family connections. Political authority emerged from family connections. Economic security emerged from family connections. Marriage strengthened family alliances. Inheritance protected family interests. Honor reflected upon entire families. The individual rarely stood alone. This helps explain why Juana's personal struggles became political matters. She wasn't simply Juana. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, the wife of Philip, the mother of Charles. Every relationship carried political consequences. Every decision affected powerful interests. Imagine trying to navigate emotional difficulties while entire dynasties monitor your behavior. The pressure would be immense. And pressure was everywhere, particularly for rulers. Modern people sometimes imagine monarchs living carefree lives surrounded by luxury. The reality was considerably more demanding. Kings and queens faced constant responsibilities, ceremonies, diplomatic negotiations, religious obligations, military concerns, financial problems, succession planning, administrative decisions. The workload could be enormous. Many rulers aged quickly under the strain. Stress is not a modern invention. Royal stress certainly wasn't. Juana's situation became unusual because she spent much of her adulthood excluded from these responsibilities. Yet the expectations surrounding her position never disappeared completely. She remained queen, even when her authority became largely symbolic. That contradiction haunted her life. Perhaps the most revealing aspect of Juana's world involves attitudes toward mental health. Modern societies still struggle with mental health issues. 16th century societies possessed far fewer tools. People recognized unusual behavior. They recognized emotional distress. They recognized psychological suffering. But explanations varied enormously. Some interpreted symptoms through religion, others through medicine, others through morality. The boundaries were often unclear. A person experiencing depression might be described in several different ways depending upon who was observing. This uncertainty affected Juana profoundly. Contemporaries lacked modern diagnostic concepts. Instead, they relied upon cultural assumptions. Those assumptions shaped every report written about her. Historians must constantly remember this. The people describing Juana were not psychologists. They were 16th century observers using 16th century ideas. That distinction matters a great deal. And finally, there was mortality. Death stood much closer to daily life than it does for many people today. Families expected losses. Children died. Parents died. Spouses died. Friends disappeared. Disease visited repeatedly. The awareness of mortality influenced everything. Art, religion, politics, personal relationships, People lived knowing that life could change suddenly. Juana experienced this reality repeatedly. The deaths of siblings altered succession plans. The death of her mother altered politics. The death of Philip altered everything. Loss followed loss, and each loss carried enormous consequences. Not merely emotional consequences, political consequences as well. In a monarchy, grief and government often became inseparable. One funeral could transform an entire kingdom. One death could redirect history. Juana lived at the center of those transformations, which brings us back to the woman herself, the queen at the heart of our story. Understanding her world doesn't solve every mystery. It doesn't tell us exactly what she thought, or precisely what she felt, or whether every accusation against her was fair. Those questions remain, but understanding her world makes the mystery more understandable. It reminds us that Juana wasn't living in isolation from history. She was living inside it, inside a world shaped by religion, hierarchy, family, reputation, mortality, and power. A world very different from our own, and yet somehow still recognizable. Because beneath all the differences, the essential human experiences remain familiar. Love, loss, fear, hope, loneliness, the desire to be understood. Those things connect us to Juana across 5 centuries. Empires rise and fall. Kingdoms disappear. Palaces crumble. But human emotions endure. And perhaps that's why her story continues speaking to us today. Not because she was a queen. Not because she became a legend. But because beneath the crown, beneath the myths, beneath the centuries of storytelling, she was ultimately something far more relatable. A person trying to survive a difficult world, just like everyone else. And in that sense, the distance between modern life and 16th century Spain suddenly feels much smaller than it first appeared. The legacy of Juana of Castile, why the Mad Queen, still haunts history. And so, after following Juana through childhood, marriage, grief, political struggle, imprisonment, old age, death, and legend, we arrive at the final chapter. Or perhaps not the final chapter. Because some stories never truly end. They simply continue changing. And Juana's story has been changing for more than 500 years. That's an astonishing thought when you stop and consider it. Entire civilizations have risen and fallen since her death. Empires have appeared and disappeared. Technologies have transformed human life beyond anything she could have imagined. People have walked on the moon, crossed oceans in hours, communicated instantly across continents. Yet somehow amid all those changes, people are still talking about Juana of Castile, still debating her life, still questioning her reputation, still wondering who she really was. Most historical figures are not granted that kind of afterlife. History is crowded with forgotten kings, forgotten queens, forgotten generals, forgotten ministers, forgotten nobles, people who once seemed enormously important and are now little more than names buried in old records. Juana avoided that fate, not because she ruled brilliantly, not because she conquered vast territories, not because she transformed Europe through military victories. Ironically, she became unforgettable because of uncertainty, because no one can fully agree on her story. And uncertainty has a strange power. Human beings dislike unanswered questions. We are naturally drawn toward mysteries. When a historical figure refuses to fit neatly into a category, people keep returning, again and again, trying to solve a puzzle that may not actually have a solution. Juana became one of those puzzles. Was she mentally ill? Was she politically manipulated? Was she a victim? Was she a ruler denied her rights? Was she all of these things simultaneously? 5 centuries later, historians still argue, and every generation brings new interpretations. In some ways, Juana's reputation tells us as much about the people studying her as it does about Juana herself. Think about how different eras viewed her. 16th century observers often focused on political utility. 19th century romantics focused on tragic love. 20th century writers frequently emphasized psychology. Modern historians often examine power structures, gender expectations, and mental health. The woman hasn't changed. The questions have, and that is one of history's most fascinating realities. Every generation rewrites the past, not by changing facts, but by changing which facts seem important. The Juana people saw in 1850 was not the Juana people see today. And the Juana historians discuss 50 years from now may look different again. That constant reinterpretation keeps her alive. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Juana's legacy is how modern audiences respond to her. Because despite the centuries separating us, many people find something deeply familiar in her story. Not the crowns, not the castles, not the dynastic politics. Those belong to another world. What feels familiar is the emotional core. The experience of being misunderstood. The experience of having others define your identity. The experience of losing control over your own narrative. These themes remain universal. Even today, people struggle against labels imposed by others. People worry about how they are perceived. People fear being reduced to a single story. Juana experienced all of those things on an extraordinary scale. Imagine becoming famous for one version of yourself while knowing that version is incomplete. Imagine spending centuries unable to correct the record. That's essentially what happened to her. History attached a label. The Mad Queen. And for generations, that label overshadowed everything else. The educated princess. The multilingual scholar. The mother of emperors and queens. The legal ruler of Castile. The woman who endured decades of confinement. All of those identities became secondary. One nickname dominated them all. Modern historians have spent decades trying to move beyond that simplification. Not because they want to replace one myth with another, but because reality deserves complexity. The deeper researchers examine Juana's life, the more complicated it becomes. And complexity is usually a sign that we're getting closer to the truth. Real people are complicated. Legends are simple. Juana spent centuries trapped inside a legend. Now, slowly, historians are rediscovering the person. There's something poetic about that process. A woman who lost her freedom in life gradually regaining some freedom in history. Freedom from stereotypes. Freedom from oversimplification. Freedom from a narrative imposed by others. Not completely, of course. The legend will probably never disappear. It's too famous, too dramatic, too deeply rooted in popular culture. The image of the grieving queen beside the coffin remains one of Europe's most enduring historical symbols. And perhaps that's fine. Legends have value too. They help preserve memory. They keep stories alive. The challenge comes when legends replace reality entirely. Modern scholarship attempts to strike a balance, acknowledging the myth while searching for the person underneath it. And what emerges is fascinating. Not a saint, not a villain, not a madwoman, not a perfect victim. Simply a human being. A woman navigating extraordinary circumstances. A woman shaped by grief, politics, family pressures, and historical forces beyond her control. A woman who endured far more than most people ever will. Perhaps that endurance is her most overlooked achievement. History tends to celebrate action, conquests, victories, revolutions, triumphs. Juana's story offers something different. A story about survival. A story about persistence. A story about enduring conditions that would have broken many others. There is a quiet dignity in that, even if history took centuries to recognize it. Another reason Juana remains relevant today involves changing conversations about mental health. Modern audiences approach psychological suffering differently than earlier generations did. We ask different questions. We consider different explanations. We recognize that emotional distress exists on a spectrum. We understand that trauma, grief, isolation, and mental illness can interact in complicated ways. When contemporary readers encounter Juana's story, they often see nuances previous generations overlooked. They recognize experiences that feel surprisingly modern. The details differ. The emotional realities often do not. This doesn't mean Juana becomes a modern figure. She belonged firmly to her own time. But it does mean her experiences continue resonating. Human psychology hasn't changed nearly as much as technology has. And then there is the question of memory itself. What do we owe people from the past? It's an interesting question, particularly when their stories have been distorted. Historians cannot resurrect the dead. They cannot interview Juana. They cannot resolve every uncertainty, but they can try to understand. They can examine evidence carefully. They can challenge assumptions. They can resist simplistic narratives. In a sense, that effort becomes an act of respect, a recognition that historical figures deserve more than caricatures. Juana certainly does. 500 years after her death, researchers continue uncovering new perspectives on her life. New documents emerge. New interpretations appear. Old conclusions are reassessed. The conversation continues, and perhaps it always will, because some historical mysteries are too rich to solve completely. They remain valuable precisely because they resist easy answers. Juana belongs in that category. The mystery is part of her legacy. As our journey comes to an end, let's return one final time to Tordesillas. The palace is quiet. The centuries have passed. The attendants are gone. The political arguments have faded. The rival kings and ambitious nobles have disappeared into history. Only the story remains. A young princess raised among Europe's most powerful rulers. A passionate marriage. A devastating loss. Decades of confinement. A reputation shaped by others. A legend that outlived an empire. And somewhere within that story, the real Juana. Still partially hidden. Still partially revealed. Still inviting us to look closer. Perhaps that's why she continues haunting history. Not because she was easy to understand, but because she wasn't. The closer we get, the more complicated she becomes. And the more complicated she becomes, the more human she feels. So tonight, as we leave 16th century Spain behind and allow the candles to burn low, remember Juana not as a myth, not as a nickname, not as a painting. Remember her as a person, a daughter, a wife, a mother, a queen, a prisoner, a survivor, a woman whose life became one of history's most enduring mysteries. And perhaps, after 5 centuries of arguments, legends, and speculation, that is the legacy she deserves most. Not certainty, but understanding. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the life of Juana of Castile. And as always, wherever you are, I hope the story has carried you gently into the quiet hours of the night. Good night.